You can clap, go ahead. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the ninth Stories About This Place event. My name is Ryan Owens, and I'm the Executive Director of the Monadnock Conservancy. So, the Monadnock Conservancy is a land conservation trust, which means we do work that seeks... I'm sorry. Does somebody have a... Oh, okay. Got it. I'm going to start over. So, as I think all of you know, the Monadnock Conservancy is a land conservation trust, which means we do work that seeks ultimately to keep land in a natural state because certain places have real special value when they're in their natural state. And we conserve land for a variety of reasons. Among them, wildlife habitat, clean water, and climate change mitigation, to name a few. But there's also a human component to land conservation, whether that's the societal benefit of the work, or the people who make it happen, or a family's heritage on a piece of land. Land is the stage on which human lives are lived, where we interact not only with the land, but with one another. Whether it's climbing mountains, tending gardens, visiting neighbors, or just driving from home to work, we all, in some way, experience what academics call a sense of place, this indescribable and visceral feeling of belonging to a particular locale. And it's this sense of belonging that is often the greatest source of love of the land and desire to protect it, which is why it is so important to tell the kinds of stories you will hear tonight. We need people to love this place where we live and help us accelerate the conservation of it like never before. I want to welcome all of our speakers, Tyler Rich, Ernie Hebert, Bob Brown and Juliana Stevens, Rebecca Rule, and welcome back to the storyteller and musical guest, Ben Cosgrove. I will not be introducing each speaker with long biographies, but in your program, you'll find a QR code that with your phone you can scan and it'll take you to more information about them. Ben will be playing some musical interludes in between each speaker as we transition, and after our third speakers, Bob and Juliana, we'll have about a 10-minute intermission. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome up Tyler to be our first speaker.
I might have already forgot how to use this. I specifically did one slide so I wouldn't have to change slides. That's us. Hi. Believe it or not, it was very common for me to once stand up in front of a lot of people and speak on a very regular basis. So I left New Hampshire when I was 22 years old. I loved it here. I had a wonderful childhood here. I had zero interest in living here. Life can be a really funny thing, because if someone told me 10 years ago that I would be married, that I would live with my wife in the small town of Nelson where I grew up, and that we would own a farm, that farm would be located on my parents' land where they built a house, where they still live today, and that we would grow food in some of the same gardens that my mom and dad grew food for our family in, I would not have believed you in a million years. And the reason's very, very simple why. 10 years ago, I didn't know my wife. 10 years ago, I didn't have a garden. I didn't live in the state, and farming was the farthest thing from my mind. 10 years ago, I was single, living in the city of Chicago, and working as a professional actor and a fight director in the theater. I loved it. It was my dream job. It's what I wanted to do since I was 16 years old. I absolutely loved it. I spent 6 days a week in a dark theater, and I couldn't have been happier. So as I stand here as a farmer in New Hampshire looking back on that, it seems like, how did this happen? How was that even in the realm of possibility of my life? I think it all kind of revolves around these two ideas, this idea of small town, rural community, and the idea of food, because I very strongly believe that food is one of the most powerful things that exists. I grew up in a house in Nelson where real food, good food, was everywhere and really important. Every dinner in the house that I grew up in, my mom, she is a wonderful cook. She cooked the majority of our meals. Every dinner, we would sit down as a family. My mom, my dad, my sister, and I, and we'd sit at the dining table with candles lit. Candles lit, lights out, family sitting down, and that's how we had dinner every single night. It didn't matter if it was Tuesday or Saturday. That's what we did, because that's what was important to my mom, and that's what was normal in my house. So as a kid, I just thought that that's how everybody had dinner. And we were really fortunate because, as I said, she's a wonderful cook. And the food was made even better by the fact that so much of it was from her gardens. She had multiple gardens. They were not small. I think that Johnny's Selected Seeds would have called her a farm and not a gardener, but this was normal to me. And all of my other friends in Nelson, all of their families had gardens, so I thought everybody had gardens. It was completely normal for me to go down to the root cellar to get potatoes or pickles and jams. It was normal to have to pick 15 pounds of green beans before I could go hang out with my friends in the summer. And it was very normal that in desperate times, my mother would pay my sister and I 5 cents for every potato bug that we would kill. We don't grow potatoes on our farm to this day because I think I was traumatized by this experience. So it became very clear to me as I left Nelson and got older that this was in fact not how everybody functioned. This is not how every dinner went down. We had something special, and I think it was over these candlelit dinners that I really fell in love with food and learned that food makes connections with people and builds community. Good food, real food. So flashback 10 years ago, and I'm living in Chicago. Real food is still very important in my life. I left this small town for a big city, but I still made it a priority to eat really good food. Once a month, I'd go out and get a nice steak or a good piece of fish. I'd go to the farmer's market, and I'd make myself a really nice meal. Because food is how I show love, because of how I grew up. Enter Jenna, my wife. When I met Jenna, she was a vegan. This was difficult for me as a cook. Not that I have anything against veganism, I don't, but I grew up in a house where we ate venison and fish and just about everything else under the sun, except for vegan food. So I didn't know how to cook for a vegan, and if I don't know how to cook for her, how can I show her that I care? So I had to learn, and it started small. It started with oatmeal. Good oats, organic steel-cut oats with fresh fruit. I'd use coconut milk instead of cream, and maple syrup, real maple syrup, which in Chicago is very expensive. But we all know in this room, as people from New Hampshire, that anything other than real maple syrup is a crime. And then this grew, and she taught me how to make other vegan things. I learned how to make black bean burgers and something called a lentil loaf that we had at Thanksgiving, which was really good. I'm going to use that as a water break. Where was I? It was really good. Thank you very much. I think the finest vegan cooking achievement that I had was making her a vegan chocolate cake on her birthday. And I remember it very well because it was 95 degrees in Chicago that day. And in her little studio apartment with the oven on, it was easily over 110. And she was at work, and I was making this cake, and over the process of making this cake, I'm sweating profusely and losing layers of clothing until by the time the cake is in the oven, I'm standing in front of it, covered in sweat, in my underwear. And if that isn't love, I don't know what is, because food is love, and love is baking a cake in a sweltering apartment in your underwear for your vegan girlfriend. So how does all of this connect to New Hampshire and to our farm. Well, a few years after dating, we ended up being the proud farmers of a 4-foot by 8-foot community garden plot on the north side of the city. It was right alongside the Amtrak train. And we grew everything we possibly could in there. Radishes, we had lettuce, carrots, peas. We were even foolish enough to put in a Brussels sprout plant that took over the entire space and yielded absolutely nothing in return to us. But we loved this. We were making salads and full things out of our garden. And this is where I got to watch Jenna fall in love with growing food, and where something that used to be a chore to me as a kid became something that I really loved to do. And somewhere in this journey, Jenna decided that maybe she wanted to go work on a farm. Maybe we wanted to go work on a farm. So after a lot of deliberation, we ended up putting our lives in storage units and headed to Western North Carolina to work at Full Sun Farm. Now, this was an 8-month internship. We had every intention of going back to the city. We put our lives in storage, an 8-month reset. Full Sun, believe it or not, was in a town smaller than Nelson. This town was called Big Sandy Mush. And we absolutely fell in love with it. And I remembered what small community can do. Within a few months, we knew what felt like everyone in town. We made friends with CSA members, people who lived down the road. We'd pet sit for people. And every week, this guy John, who lived just down the way, would come over. And he used to be a sound engineer for the Grateful Dead. And we'd wash lettuce together. We found this community. Well, a few months in, it became abundantly clear that we were not going to go back to the city. Jenna didn't want to go back to an office after months in the sun, and I did not miss the theater enough to want to go back. And it was at this time that my parents called. And my mom said something along the lines of, our land here, it's steep, it's rocky, it's not great, but you could come and start a farm here. I think the sentence was, you could come start here. Looking back, I imagine in my mom's mind, she was thinking that we could start growing things there, and then eventually we would go somewhere else and grow things just kind of down the road. But we heard that as, you can come start a farm here. And that's exactly what happened. And because of that, my parents have completely lost the front half of their hillside. And because of that, they'd become our greatest supporters and our biggest help on the farm. Now, my mom, she was still gardening at the time, but the scale was a lot smaller. But all the gardens were still there. And instead of food, she had put them into cover crop. They were just waiting. It's like she knew. So we came here, and we started this farm, and again, we found out about the power of this community, this New Hampshire community. You see, we go to a market every week. We go to the Peterborough market. It's just down the road. It's on Wednesdays. And these people that started out as our customers are now our friends. We sell food to our friends. Over the course of 4 or 5 years, going into our 6th season, these people are not our customers. They are our friends. And we buy from other vendors at the market who are also our friends. We know people that make the bread that we eat. We know the people who raise the animals that we eat. Those relationships are one of the reasons that Jenna now eats meat. Well, it's true. She knows it's raised by friends who care about what they do. Remember, food is love, and food builds community. So we sow our seeds every spring, and we work our soil every spring for our friends. Our annual plant sale, it feels like a little party to us, as friends that we haven't seen through the winter come over, talk and laugh in the sun. These people, many of them who I knew when I was a kid, they come over to support us and make us feel at home, to remind us that we're exactly where we should be. We came here to start this business and start this life that brought us community and brought us family, all of those things that I had when I was a kid in this small town. And all of those things have been found through food. Now, when we're at the market and someone comes into our tent, someone that I don't know, and they say, "What's a shishito pepper?" That's the absolute best time, because I get to tell them not only what it is, but how I like to cook it, what to do with it. I convince them to try it, and they take it home, and they come back the next week, And they say, man, I tried that thing you told me to try. It was excellent. Also, I found this other recipe. Here's a recipe. You try it. And I'll go home and cook. And we come back the next week, and we talk about flavors and food. And all of a sudden, that shishito pepper, that little basket of shishitos, made us friends. And these conversations are so common to have at market. It doesn't matter if these people are 80 years old or 20. Food connects us. And I'm so fortunate that I get to go grow food in this community. So I'll leave you with this. When I was asked to get up here and tell a story, I had no idea what it would be about. But the thing I kept coming back to was what we do for a living. It's my passion for food. I went and started farming because it was something that Jenna wanted to try. It sounded interesting to me. It was temporary. Why not? I fell in love with it because the food is amazing. But the friends I made over the food are absolutely unforgettable. And what's wonderful about our job is we get to go home at the end of the day, at the end of a market, and we cook a wonderful meal. We sit down, and I know that the produce on our plate was grown by us, that the chicken was raised by our friend Maggie, the bread was made by our buddy John, the eggs I eat in the morning, the cream in my coffee is from our friend Jody, and we get to eat that meal made by us, but made by our friends. And we eat that every day of our lives. So whether I'm eating in a room full of people or I'm eating completely alone, I'm eating with my friends. Friends who welcomed us to this community, and friends that we made over food. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much to Tyler. Mesmerizing story. My name is Ben Cosgrove. I guess I'm your Paul Schaefer for this evening. And it's now my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, who is Frank Hebert. Oh my God, sorry. The paper is simply too far away. Ernest Hebert is the next. Here's it.
My hearing is so bad that Becky had to tell me that he was introducing me. I had no idea.
If it makes you feel better, I was introducing somebody else.
Can you all hear me? Okay, good. I have to find page 1 here. Oh, who is that guy? That picture was taken by my wife, Medora, at Grand Isle, Louisiana. Anybody been there? You must go. It's a fabulous place. This is what I'm going to talk about, this cabin. That's me at age 34, 35, something like that. And this is when I was building this cabin, and you can see, behind you there's the start of what's going to be a deck. And on the right-hand corner, eventually there was a refrigerator there that I'm going to talk about. So when I bring up the refrigerator, just picture the deck made and the refrigerator in the right-hand corner, okay? When I was coming of age as a fiction writer, I built a 12 by 16 foot cabin on a piece of forest land that I bought from dear friends and neighbors on Valley Road in Sullivan. It was my belly flop into the counterculture of the 1970s. My cabin was crude, built with recycled barn boards, salvage, and rough-cut pine boards that I bought cheap from Cody and Rennie Lumber Company in Grantham. I liked it crude. I had a dream of expanding the cabin into my version of a back-to-the-land homestead inspired by the Mother Earth News and Living the Good Life by Helen and Scott Nearing. However, my wife Medora had the strange and peculiar idea of starting a family in a residential neighborhood in a nice community. By the way, today is our 55th wedding anniversary. And when we got married, she was a 19-year-old sophomore at Keene State College, and I was a 27-year-old senior, robbing the cradle. That's all worked out. Anyway, she couldn't be here today because she was busy all afternoon with another committee meeting and just didn't have to go. So anyway, so I had a choice, a family or a dream. Easy decision. I chose family, but I didn't quit the dream. I redreamed the cabin as real estate for my literary world. I rented the material world cabin to Margie, a young woman who was trying to live the counterculture life. I never saw a woman dressed so down. Baggy blue jeans, work boots, flannel shirt, no makeup, no evidence that her hair was ever brushed or combed. When I would come by to pick up the rent money, she seemed withdrawn and terribly unhappy. I tried to strike up conversations, but I sensed that she was afraid of me, so I backed off. One day, she was gone. She needed somebody or something in her life. I don't know what. The problem for her, I think, was she didn't know either. I hope somewhere along the line she found it, whatever it was. I sold the cabin and acreage to Rob, known locally as a crazy man. It was said he had a plate in his head, that he was a traumatized Vietnam War veteran. That last part, I'm sure, was true. He installed a privy, which he said, quote unquote, kicked. If it got too bad, he treated the waste the way the GIs did in Vietnam. Dump gasoline on it and light a match. Not only did we napalm the local people, we napalmed our own piles of shit. Several years later, in a moment of wistfulness, I visited Rob to gaze at my former cabin and land. Everything looked normal, except the door was open. Through the window, I could see a half cup of coffee on the tiny table that I had whacked out from salvage barn boards. On the outside deck of the cabin, Rob had placed a refrigerator where an extension cord ran along the ground to a hookup on the utility pole. I opened the fridge. It was crammed, but the only details I remember are a jar of Hellman's real mayonnaise and ground beef wrapped in butcher paper. I headed home, which at the time was West Lebanon. I never did find Rob that day, even though his coffee was there. Okay, now flash ahead to 1993. This is some years later. I returned to the cabin on a winter day. My goal was to photograph it for the cover of a book that the University Press of New England was printing, The Kinship, which included two of my then out-of-print Darby novels, A Little More Than Kin and The Passion of Estelle Jordan, plus a long essay I'd written about the idea of kinship in the Jordan clan. I was hoping to reunite with Rob, hoping that he had gotten over his war trauma. By the way, I brought this book, The Kinship, here, and I'm donating this book to the Conservancy. And I brought two other books which are back there somewhere, and you can just first come, first serve. Just grab it. Just two books. I know you're going to be fighting for it, but it's a. So anyway, I'm giving away two books. There was no answer to my knock on the door. I peeked through the window from the deck. Everything looked the same, including the coffee cup on the little table. I noticed now that the extension cord from the fridge to the utility pole was gone, so no electric power. I opened the refrigerator. Nothing had changed. I was curious to unwrap the butcher paper and see what a pound of ground beef looked like after 15 or so years. But I was halted by a wave of squeamishness. Medora had become a professional photographer working for the Valley News in Lebanon, and she had loaned me one of her Nikon SLRs, but I didn't bother to learn how to operate it. Result, lousy pictures. The design people at the press fudged my amateurish photography and came up with a passable cover for The Kinship, though the cabin is obscured, as you'll see when you look at the cover. I made some inquiries and discovered that Rob had moved to Florida. Later still, I learned he died, probably a suicide. 4 or 5 years passed. I returned to the cabin with my childhood friend Dennis Patnode on a hot summer day. The door to the cabin was now padlocked. Everything looked the same as it did a decade earlier, including the coffee cup on the tiny table. I opened the fridge, still in its place on the deck, wondering if there'd be a bad smell, but of course there was none. Anything organic must have dried out long ago. I have the memory of the sight of the jar of Hellmann's real mayonnaise. The oil had separated and floated to the top. The color and consistency of grade B maple syrup. Below was a gray sludge. Now, I'm sure you've always wanted to know what mayo looks like in its state after 15 or 20 plus years. And I just told you. Anyway, the experience of this just messed up my head. I realized I was trespassing, and I just wanted to get out of there. Another decade plus went by before I returned to the property in 2022, so not too long ago. The cabin was gone, the site scraped, but upslope where I had dug a shallow well was a new plywood structure, bigger and uglier than my cabin, more like the shacks I imagined that my Jordan clan inhabited. I was swept by a grief and some other unpleasant emotion I cannot pin down. Guilt, maybe. I never should have built the cabin. It ended up an eyesore to the people of Sullivan and a disappointment to its inhabitants. The cabin is not lost. It exists in a space between memory and imagination that constitute my Darby novels. The current resident, my fictional hermit, Cootie Patterson. One reason I wrote this today was, or wrote this for this thing is that I'm actually writing a novel now where the cabin comes back and Cootie Patterson is the protagonist. What I regret today is my inability to form some kind of bond between myself and Margie, that troubled young woman who rented the cabin, and Rob, the troubled young veteran who bought it. In my mind, the two of them represent the tragedies of competing politics that continue in present day. What else in present day? My dear friends and neighbors, divorced. Their homestead sold. My childhood friend, Dennis, dead. Me, I can't get over the feeling that I owe something to somebody in a valley of broken dreams. Thanks.
I'm going to read this one closely. Our next speakers are Bob Brown and Juliana Stevens.
And the magic of technology, maybe. That's us. And we'd like to tell you a story of the love of Mill Hollow, love in Mill Hollow, and love of Chase's Mill in Mill Hollow in East Alsted. I grew up on my great-grandparents' farm in Alsted Center. It was given to my parents as a wedding present. We had the usual cast of characters. We had cows and horses, pigs and sheep, chickens and turkeys and geese. Hated those geese. Dogs and cats, and depending upon the year, raccoons and a crow. And of course, a large vegetable garden. Dora was the matriarch of the field. She was not averse to having a child riding on her back in the summer, lying down, reading a book as she surveyed her territory. I'm not sure how my mother survived. In the early years, my father was still in the Merchant Marines, and my mother ran the farm with 5 kids under 5. One rescuer was Edith Chase Nursery School in Mill Hollow. In the spring and fall, the roads were too awful in the winter. We went to school at Heman and Edith, where we enjoyed reading, we explored nature and science, and we baked bread, and we hammered nails. Oh, that was my mother's tractor and me driving it 70 years later. I was 3 on the day when Yankee Magazine came to write a story about Edith's nursery school. I did not make a great choice when I decided to hide in the middle of the millstone while playing hide and seek. And of course, those adults took the picture before rescuing. So my early connection to Chase's Mill had mixed reviews. In the summer, after the chores were done, we went swimming at Dennett's Beach, a small private beach across the road from the Chases. On the luckiest days, when we were packing to leave and my mother would still be visiting, we would run across the road and play in the water wheel that Heman had set up in Lake Edith. Then, if she stopped at the mill to talk to Heman, we would jump in the mill pond for one last swim. Small farms were hard work with a lot of fond memories, and we're so thankful to the Monadnock Conservancy for stewarding our family lands in both Alsted and in Walpole.
In the summer of 1953, my parents, both educators, were looking for a place to summer with us 4 kids. Through a friend, they met Mary Burroughs and discovered Mill Hollow. Mary and her husband, Walter, lived in the brick house in the center of this upper level of the buildings there. And operated a small farm, including a cow barn and a horse barn. Her brother Heman owned the blacksmith shop on the far left and the sheep barn on the far right, and right in the center, he owned an old water-powered mill. It's what's now called Chase's Mill. Mary showed my parents a place we might rent. She supposed we could rent it, but there was no running water and no indoor plumbing. and we were from suburbia. My parents thought it was perfect. It became our summer home for the next 20 years. The woodshed loft was then housing rummage and antiques, and was tongue-in-cheek called the American Wing, after the American Wing of the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. Attached to the American Wing was the old Banks Sugar House, way over on the right. Later became rechristened as the Cloister, where my parents could find some peace and quiet apart from us kids. Mill Hollow offered us endless fun, playing with the farm animals, haying, riding horses, doing farm chores, catching frogs along Warren Brook, and swimming in Lake Warren at Dennett's Beach. Now, there's been a mill in Mill Hollow since 1767. The first one was a grist mill. And by 1770, a sawmill had been added about 100 feet below it, and then others afterwards. In the early 1900s, an architect named Hartley Dennett moved up to the holler from Boston and created Dennett's Mill with his partner, Margaret Chase, mother of Heman and Mary. We learned from Heman that there had been as many as 5 mills once clustered here within 300 feet of one another. Heman's daughter, Ellen, drew this picture based on Heman's historical research. The grist mill on the left of the dam became Chase's Mill, and on the right was a fulling mill. Both large overshot wheels were probably replaced in the later 1800s when the more popular water turbines came in. In that summer of '53, we met Heman and Edith Chase. Very gentle people, sweet, talented, of the Quaker persuasion. He a surveyor and engineer, she a poet and a baker of the most wonderful bread. I fell in love with Mill Hollow and its people, especially the mill, and Heman became my surrogate grandfather. Saturday mornings, when he often worked in the mill, we brown kids were invited to drop in and use the shop. We picked up many basic skills, and in a self-directed, exploratory way, we learned tons. Heman and Edith, both natural teachers, decided to invite more and more local children to what became the regular Saturday morning shop classes. The experience was to leave its mark on those who participated. By my teen years, I was working for Heman in a variety of capacities, including as a rod man on surveys. As we periodically rested in the woods, he was fond of telling me stories. By 1971, my parents had decided to purchase the American Wing, winterize it, and retire there. I was fresh out of college. My brother was fresh out of the Navy. We thought we'd pitch in and help him get started. A neighbor offered us an old barn built in 1775 and destined for demolition. We decided to use this wood in building their home. Taking buildings apart, we thought, was a great way to learn how to build. We used almost all of those timbers in building the frame connecting the American Wing to the cloister. The 200-year-old weathered boards on the outside of that mill, the 200-year-old weathered siding we carefully reinstalled across the south side of this exterior. These boards, once sawed at a full inch thick and almost certainly sawn in the sawmill below the original grist mill, were now weathered down to 1/2 inch thick. The boards are still there doing their job, and now almost 250 years old, and likely the oldest exterior wood to be found in Alstead. We felt good about saving some of that history. By 1975, after 3 summers on this project, I felt I had to move on. And I was thinking about moving west, where I had spent my winters. But I loved contra dancing. And I went to one last dance.
I was planning a 3-month driving trip around the country, but my departure was delayed by an emergency week-long visit to the hospital. The day I got out, I decided to go to one last dance before heading west. As I entered the dance hall, across the room I saw this cute guy that I'd never seen before. I asked my brother if he knew who he was, and my brother said, well, he was a Dartmouth grad. He's nationally classed in the decathlon, and he's building a house for his parents. I said, that sounds like the man I'm going to marry, so I better ask him to dance. And I did. I asked him where he lived, and he said, Mill Hollow. I don't think so. I know everybody in Mill Hollow. I asked him how long he lived there, and he said 20 years. And I said, I don't think so. I asked him where he swam. That was always the kicker. And he said Dennett's Beach. And I said, I don't think so. That's where I swim. And further questioning, it was established that he came up for the summers. He could swim in the heat of the day. I was a farm girl. I could swim after chores. For 20 years, we didn't meet. I took my trip west, but he stayed in the east. On my return, after teaching another semester, we talked on New Year's Eve, and I asked him to marry me, and he said yes. We lived in the unheated cloister of the American wing where the snow would blow in under our bed. Later, we built our house of stone and wood from our land, raised our 2 boys, and continued to swim at Dennett's Beach.
Oops. This one.
Oh, did you turn it upside down?
I had it upside down. That's a difficult situation for me to handle. Well, on the morning of our anniversary, October 9th, in 2005, we woke up to rain, lots of rain. I recall sirens in the distance. We started to hear word of flooding and that the Lake Warren Dam had broken and there was terrible damage. By the time we got over to look, the water had greatly receded, the mill stood firm. The Warren Pond Dam had not collapsed, but there had been terrible damage. This is very sensitive. The water had pushed hard against the mill and passed around it on all sides. It had remarkably survived, and earlier in the year, the owner had passed away, and the new owners decided that they really needed to do something about it, and they set about attempting to save the mill. They held meetings, did some immediate repairs, protected the rotting roof from further damage, And very importantly, they got the mill on the 2009 7 to Save list of the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance. This designated the mill as an historic property worthy of saving. Community interest grew. By 2012, a nonprofit had been formed. By 2016, the mill was purchased. New Hampshire Preservation Alliance gave us a grant for an engineering study that set our path forward. The LCHIP program offered us a grant to get started. Ingram Construction became our partner in this project, and we started tackling the foundation first. We went up through the foundation, every floor, stabilizing the structure as it was, inserting ridge beams and rafters where needed, and making sure that it stood firm and solid. We restored the waterworks so that it was a water-powered mill after all. Then we restructured the roof. The dormers had been taken on. We put the dormers back on and then rebuilt the roof much stronger than it had been. We strengthened the dam. We re-shingled the outside. And by 2020, with the help of a lot of dedicated people, the mill was ready to reopen as a community resource for Mill Hollow.
Following in Hartley Dennett's and Heman Chase's footsteps, we're hoping that Chase's Mill will be a place that benefits the community. Beyond the water power tours, we offer a wide variety of classes from not sensitive enough, from experiential learning with school children, class in sustainability with Rutgers students. We have Heman's remarkable working models for sawmills and grist mills. We have woodworking for young and old, craft and painting classes, concerts and dances, and the list goes on. Last year, we began our year with a concert on Dennett's Field. The local musicians played their songs inspired by Mill Hollow. And we'd like to finish with a poem by Edith Newland Chase. There's a little gray house in Mill Hollow, between wooded hills and the pond. There's a small, winding road you can follow through meadows and forests beyond. There's a brook dancing down to the valley and a hilltop that beckons to climb. There are peaceful, still places to dally. So won't you come see them sometime?
All right, folks, we're going to get started again in just a minute. Do you want to find your seats? Thank you. We're going to run a show here. Our next speaker is the great Rebecca Rule.
Hello. Can you hear me in the back? As the moderator said and up in the balcony, as the moderator said at town meeting, and the fella said no. And the moderator says, count your blessings. I'm an imposter. I didn't grow up here. I don't live here. I have never climbed Mount Monadnock. I pause now for that to sink in. But the first show that we did for our hometown on New Hampshire PBS was, of course, in Peterborough, our town. I've told stories in Keene and Dublin and Walpole and Rindge and Deering and Alstead, which is never called Alstead. I know how to pronounce Lineborough. So I think that gives me some credibility. Last night, I was in Greenfield, swapping stories with Adele Hale, Roger Swain, Lenny Conwall. You know them. You know them because everybody in New Hampshire knows everybody else. And we're related to most of them. New Hampshire is a small state. We are connected. So I'm going to tell you a few Monadnock stories, and then I'm going to go to another part of the state for the Boffo ending. So last night I heard this story. There was a couple that came all dressed up in a big car with out-of-state plates. They didn't say what state it was, and they came wheeling up to the church in Greenfield on a Sunday afternoon. And they got out of their car all excited and said, "Where is the wedding?" And a local who was there said, "Where do you think you are?" And they said, "Greenfield, Massachusetts." And the local said, "You're going to be late." Everyone loves his native state, whether he was born here or not. That's a quote from Keith Jennison, whose excellent collection of Yankee humor published in the 1980s was called, one of my favorite book titles ever, Yup, Nope, and Other Conversations from Vermont. So you've heard some amazing stories, very hard for me to follow, but I'm going to try. I'm going to do it anyway for the next 10 minutes or so. Stories need a beginning, a middle, an ending, and a surprise. They don't have to be long, they don't have to be elaborate, but if they've got a beginning, middle, and ending, and a surprise, it's a story. And I'm going to tell you the shortest story I know. It's from the town of Deering, New Hampshire. I said, "Who's got a good Deering story?" And a fellow in the back says, "I think I do." And I said, "Go ahead, tell it." And he said, "Well, fella run for selectman once, unopposed, and he lost." That's a story. Think about it. I later learned from people with inside information that, in fact, that selectman was an incumbent. So I do have a Monadnock story from the Monadnock region story from the town of Greenville, New Hampshire, right? That's Monadnock, isn't it? Monadnock region. I've been to Greenville. I was there quite a bit. One winter, I went over and did stories at Meals on Wheels sites in that area. And a fellow named Steve told me this story. He said that he had grown up in Greenville, and he had a great aunt whose name was Nan Davis. And Nan Davis lived in the wilds of Greenville. And she was an independent Yankee woman. She had her own little house out there in the woods. She heated with wood. She cooked for herself. She took care of herself. She was in her 90s. So the family worried about her a little bit, being so remote. So every evening, Steve's mother would call Nan Davis on the telephone. Now, Nan Davis, being an independent Yankee woman, would not rush to answer the phone. She would answer it in her own good time. So sometimes it ran quite a long while and would ring, and finally Nan would pick up and give that warm Yankee greeting, "What do you want?" And then they'd know she was okay. Well, one evening it rang longer than it had ever rung before. And Mother said, "You kids get your coats on. We're going to have to drive out. I think something has happened to Nan Davis." And they started to go out the door, and Mother said, wait, she's picking up. And Mother said, "Nan Davis." And Nan Davis says, all out of breath, "What do you want?" And Mother said, "What is going on?" And Nan Davis said, "You won't believe it. I looked out my kitchen window, and there on my porch was a moose. And it was a big moose with a huge rack all covered in velvet, and that moose was rubbing its rack against the uprights that hold up my porch roof. So I took my broom and I went out on the porch to persuade that moose to leave. He did not want to go. Took a lot of persuading, but finally off he went down the road, and I heard the phone ring, and so I rushed in to answer it. And Mother said, "Nan Davis, are you all right?" And she said, "Not by a long shot." She said, "I broke my best broom." That is a quintessential New Hampshire story. I think the difference between a joke and a story is character. And New Hampshire is full of character and characters. And I'll give you an example. This is a Yankee trader story, you know, our famous Yankee trader stories. It was told to me by Brian Fitzgerald, and he said this happened, this was in the days before automobiles, when everybody went around in a wagon or on horseback or on foot. There was, you know, wagons were the big thing, and there was a wagon maker in town. And a fellow lived in town said to the wagon maker, he said, "Charlie, when a fellow asks you how much you charge to make a wagon, what do you say?" And Charlie said, "Well, I look him straight in the eye, and I say, $30. And if he don't flinch, I look him straight in the eye, and I say, wheels are $5. And if he still don't flinch, I look him straight in the eye, and I say, each." That's a Yankee trader story. I heard this story last night in Greenfield. This is how I make my living. I hear stories and I repeat them. I am basically a macaw. But this was a story, they just brought out a new history in Greenfield called, what's it called? I don't know. In the Shadow of Crotched Mountain. That's what their new history is called. It's full of characters. And one of the characters is Fred Smith. And Fred Smith, they said, enjoyed cigars, beer, and tea. And his tea was brewed in 4 pots. Day 1, the pot is on the front of the Glenwood stove. Day 2, it goes to back 1 little step, and then a new pot is stuck there. And by the 4th day, when the first pot is at the back of the Glenwood stove, that's when the tea is just right for drinking. And his niece, Florence, lived with him and took care of him, and I guess she made the tea because she went into the hospital, and Fred Smith went to the hospital to see her, and he said he was complaining because he said that his tea did not it just wasn't right since she'd been gone. And she said, "You'll drink it and you'll like it." And he said, "I'll drink it, but I won't like it," which is, I think, the New Hampshire way of saying, "I love you, I miss you, and I appreciate what you've done all these years for me." Just not in those exact words. There's a saying that the other day a friend of mine, Sam came to the house, and I had just cooked a blueberry crisp, and right out of the oven. And I said, "Sam, would you like some blueberry crisp?" "Well, all right." And he sat down, and I spooned him out a bowl of blueberry crisp made with Maine blueberries, those tiny little ones that I had picked myself by hand last summer and frozen, thousands of them. And so he took a bite, and he said, "What's in here besides blueberries?" And I said, "Peaches. I put peaches in to make it sweet." "Those little hard thing ain't peaches. What's that?" I said, "Well, I sprinkled some crushed nuts on top." And he said, "Well, if you got rid of the nuts, you'd have something." And the other New Hampshire saying that I love is, "It's not so bad that it couldn't have been worse." So I've been thinking about the optimistic Yankee, and I feel that might be considered a contradiction in terms, the optimistic Yankee, but it's really not. You just have to look deep into it. You have to really probe the Yankee character. And I'll give you an example. I'm going to give you two examples. One is from a fellow named Mark Winkley. Mark Winkley owned a Model T, and he drove it all over the state of New Hampshire. He drove it to the seacoast and the mountains and to the Monadnock region. And whenever the weather was good, he'd be out in his Model T. Well, his son got worried. He said, "Dad, if you keep driving that Model T hundreds of miles every summer, by the time I inherit it, it'll be all worn out." And Mark said, "Don't worry. You're not going to inherit it." And his father said, and his son said, "What do you mean?" And Mark Winkley said, "I'm going to be buried in that Model T." And his son said, "Why is that?" And Mark said, "Because I never saw a hole a Model T couldn't get out of." That is Yankee optimism. I'm going to take you to another part of the state, up to Freedom, New Hampshire. You know Freedom, New Hampshire, up on Ossipee Lake, for an example of Yankee optimism. Freedom, of course, attracts a lot of summer people because of the big lake and other bodies of water there. And people, they have camps on the lake, and they come up, from other exotic places like Massachusetts and Connecticut, places like that, New York. And they come up to Freedom, New Hampshire in the summer, and they're so excited to be there that they can't control themselves. They shoot off fireworks all times of the day or night, and the natives don't like it. Scares the horses. So at town meeting one year, one of our great New Hampshire traditions, town meeting, at town meeting one year, there was a petitioned warrant article to ban fireworks in Freedom, New Hampshire. Yeah. But of course, at town meeting, you can discuss things and you can make amendments and you can come to consensus, and that's what they did. And now the regulation established at town meeting many years ago in Freedom is this: fireworks are banned in Freedom, New Hampshire, except for 3 occasions during the year. 1, New Year's Eve. 2, the 4th of July. And 3, for 24 hours following the final out. when the Red Sox win the World Series. I'm going to end with a small story. I called it my COVID story for a long time, but now I'm calling it my way to live your life story. It's a very simple story. It goes like this. There was a man and his son got up early in the morning, and they went down to the river to fish, just a little boy. And they cast their lines upon the water and sat on the bank. And it was a sunny day, a beautiful sunny day, and the sun shone in on them, and the little boy, who wasn't used to getting up real early like that, felt that sun on his face, and he fell asleep. He keeled over on the bank of the river and slept for quite a long time. And while he was sleeping, the fog rolled in, a thick, thick fog. He woke up, he looked around, he said, "Daddy, we ain't here anymore." And his father said, "Don't worry, son, we ain't far from here." Thank you.
Thank you guys very, very much. Thank you, Becky. I hate having to follow that. For those of you who haven't met yet, my name is Ben Cosgrove, and I write piano music about landscape. I'm a geography nerd trapped in the body of a piano player, which is how I got mixed up in this mess. And this sort of puts me in a funny situation because I mostly write music about places that confuse me. So I have all this music. The Monadnock region is where I kind of spent most of my childhood learning to find my way in the world. And so this seems like the most normal place in the world. And I have all this music I've written about how, like Kansas is too flat and the ocean is too salty and the Rocky Mountains are too disorienting. But I have no music about the Monadnock region because it's just right. So I was trying to think about what I would play tonight, and I thought that one of the things I value most about this region is about the Monadnock Conservancy is very central to this in a lot of ways. There are a few places I can think of where people and nature kind of live alongside each other in such a well-balanced way. And I actually wrote an album a couple of years ago that gets at this, where I realized that I'd been going around the country and from town to town, playing piano every night and talking to people about the places I was writing about. And I found that, like, very much by accident, I was talking every night about, I have all this music about oceans and all this music about national parks and all this music about wilderness areas. And I had completely neglected places that have people in them. And I began to worry that, like, by doing this, I might inadvertently be reinforcing an idea about, like, what nature is and where we might find it that is not actually the one I believe in, which is, of course, that, like, the tree in your backyard is every bit as wild and interesting and worthy of wonder as one in the middle of a national park. So I decided I would write a whole record about moments of overlap between the built and natural environments, where it's sort of hard to tell what is nature and what isn't. Like, the first song is about plants growing up through the cracks in the sidewalk, and there's another song about a rainstorm in a city where you can't see where you're going, that sort of stuff. And the song I've decided to play, in no small reason because it's the most dramatic on the album, is one that I wrote about gardens, because I kind of thought about this when Tyler was talking earlier. Gardens have always struck me as this fun kind of these weird situations where human beings try to apply reason and order and right angles and straight lines to all these organisms that just want to kind of explode everywhere and take over everything and do what they'll do. And that tension has always been interesting to me. I thought it would make good music. And the title of the song is This Rush of Beauty and the Sense of Order, which is a line I stole directly from E.B. White, who has not complained yet. But the line comes. His wife Catherine White was a very avid gardener, and they would frequently be several states apart. 'Cause, he'd be in New York, she'd be in Maine, and vice versa. So they have this very spirited and well documented correspondence. And at the end of one of these letters he wrote to her, he wrote this very cute poem about gardens and gardening. The last two lines of which are, "Not sun, not soil alone shall bring to border this rush of beauty and this sense of order." And I don't know, this felt like an appropriate song to play for the Monadnock Conservancy night. By the way, it makes me sound very learned and well-read to be able to quote that to you, but I actually read it it's written on the floor of the mall in South Portland, Maine. So, but I did some Googling and figured it out. Thank you very much for being here.